My parents forced me to scrub a spilled drink off the floor at my sister's high society wedding to avoid embarrassing the family. But when a billionaire tech mogul at the VIP table saw my face, he stood up, bowed his head and called me his boss. In that single moment, my family's confidence disappeared, and the wedding they had spent months planning began falling apart before everyone's eyes. Before I tell you how it happened, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing people from different places join these stories. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another one. Stay with me until the end because what started as public humiliation turned into the most unbelievable financial revenge my family could have imagined. My name is Tinsley, and growing up I always felt like I never truly belonged in my own family. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, had already decided I would never measure up. No matter how hard I worked or how quietly I lived, I was always compared to my younger sister, Daphne. She was their favorite in every possible way. While she received endless praise, expensive gifts, and constant attention, I was treated like someone they simply had to tolerate. When Daphne became engaged to Vance Sterling, the heir to a powerful political and real estate family, my parents acted as if the wedding was the greatest achievement our family had ever known. Every conversation revolved around the Sterling name, their influence, and the important guests who would attend. I barely existed unless they needed someone to criticize. Whenever relatives asked what I was doing with my life, my parents laughed and answered for me. They told everyone I cleaned houses because I couldn't make anything better of myself. They said I had wasted every opportunity one was given and that I lived a small, forgettable life. Some people looked embarrassed for me while others believed every word without asking a single question. I never corrected them. I simply smiled, stayed quiet, and let them believe the story they had created. They had no idea that my real life was completely different from the one they described. The truth was something I had carefully protected for years, and none of them were even close to discovering it. I accepted the wedding invitation hoping I could attend the ceremony peacefully, congratulate my sister, and leave without creating any problems. Unfortunately, my parents had something very different planned for me. The truth was that everything my parents believed about me was completely wrong. I was never a house cleaner and I never struggled to survive. Years earlier, after leaving home, I built a business from the ground up without asking anyone in my family for help. I stayed away from interviews, social events, and magazine covers because I wanted my work to speak for itself. Very few people even knew what I looked like. I was the founder and managing director of Vanguard Crest, one of the largest venture capital firms in the country. Our company invested in growing businesses, rescued failing corporations, and managed billions of dollars in assets. Every major decision passed across my desk before it reached anyone else. The privacy I protected wasn't because I was hiding. It was because staying anonymous allowed me to make decisions without outside pressure or unwanted attention. Several months before Daphne's wedding, my legal team completed one of our biggest financial deals. Vanguard Crest quietly purchased a large portfolio of distressed business loans from several lenders. It was a routine investment for us, but the names included in those files caught my attention. My father's struggling logistics company was among them. So were several loans connected to the Sterling family's real estate projects and political organizations. Neither family knew the ownership of those debts had changed. They believed they were still dealing with traditional financial institutions. Instead, every payment, every agreement, and every extension now flowed through a company that answered directly to me. I never used that information against them because I had no interest in revenge. I simply treated their accounts like every other investment under our management. When the wedding invitation arrived, I almost declined. Years of rejection had taught me that nothing good ever happened when I returned home. Still, part of me hoped that attending my sister's wedding might be a chance to leave the past behind. I chose a simple dress instead of anything expensive because I didn't want attention. I wanted to congratulate Daphne, sit quietly through the ceremony, and leave before anyone noticed me. The moment I arrived, I realized nothing had changed. My mother greeted other guests with warm smiles before handing me my seating card without even making eye contact. My table wasn't with the family or the other guests. It was placed at the very back of the ballroom near the kitchen doors, where servers walked in and out carrying trays. Even then, I stayed silent because I believed enduring one uncomfortable evening was easier than starting another family argument. The ballroom slowly filled with some of the most powerful people in the state. Luxury cars lined the entrance while photographers welcomed politicians, business owners, investors, and well-known executives. Every guest seemed eager to shake hands with the influential Sterling family. Their name carried wealth, power, and connections, and they made sure everyone noticed it. The head table was reserved for the most important guests. Right in the center sat Gage Thorne, a legendary technology billionaire whose company had transformed the industry over the last 20 years. People spoke about him with respect because his business empire stretched across several countries. Few people knew that many of his company's biggest expansion projects had only become possible because of funding approved through Vanguard Crest. Gage knew exactly who controlled those investments, even if he had only met me privately a handful of times. From where I sat near the kitchen doors, I could clearly see the head table. Gage appeared relaxed as he spoke with executives and investors, while the Sterling family proudly entertained everyone around them. They believed they were hosting the most important people in the room, completely unaware that the person with the greatest financial influence was sitting alone at the back of the ballroom. During the cocktail hour, my parents wandered from group to group introducing relatives and important guests to the Sterlings. Eventually they spotted me standing quietly with a glass of water. Instead of ignoring me, they called me over with bright smiles that immediately made me uneasy. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder and laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is our oldest daughter," he said. "We invited her just in case the cleaning crew missed a spot." Several people chuckled before my mother added, "She's cleaned enough houses to know exactly what she's doing." The Sterlings laughed with them as though it were the funniest joke of the evening. Even Vance grinned and shook his head, amused by the story. Not one person questioned how parents could speak about their own daughter that way in front of hundreds of guests. Every word stung, but I refused to argue. This day was supposed to belong to Daphne, and I wouldn't create a scene that would follow her forever. I simply forced a small smile, stepped away from the group, and returned to my table. My silence convinced everyone that I had accepted my place. They mistook patience for weakness, never imagining that before the night ended, the balance of power in that ballroom would change completely. Dinner had just begun when the atmosphere changed in an instant. A young waiter hurried across the ballroom carrying a large tray filled with wine glasses and serving dishes. As he passed near the head table, another server stepped into his path. The two accidentally collided. The tray slipped from his hands, crashing onto the polished floor. Glass shattered in every direction as red wine and thick gravy splashed across the spotless white dance floor only a few feet from the bride and groom. The music stopped. Conversations faded into silence. Several members of the venue staff rushed forward with towels and cleaning supplies, ready to handle the accident within seconds. It was a simple mistake that could have been cleaned without anyone thinking twice. Before the staff could reach the spill, my mother suddenly raised her voice. "Tinsley," she shouted across the ballroom. Every head turned toward me. I stood frozen beside my table as she waved me over with an impatient look. People stepped aside while I slowly walked toward the center of the room, already knowing nothing good was about to happen. Without saying a kind word, Eleanor grabbed a cleaning cloth from one of the employees and pushed it into my hands. Then she smiled proudly at the Sterling family and the VIP guests. "Don't worry," she announced with a laugh. "Our oldest daughter is a professional maid. She's used to cleaning up messes like this." Laughter spread through several tables. Some guests looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up. They simply watched. I quietly handed the cloth back to the employee and said, "The staff already has everything under control." Before I could step away, my father moved closer. His expression turned cold enough that I recognized the warning immediately. "You'll do exactly what your mother said," Richard whispered through clenched teeth. "If you refuse, don't expect to be welcome at another family gathering. You can forget about seeing your relatives ever again." His words hit harder than I expected. I looked around the room and saw dozens of people staring at me. Daphne avoided my eyes. Vance stood beside her with an amused smile, making no effort to stop what was happening. I felt every bit of strength drain from me. I didn't want a shouting match in the middle of my sister's wedding. Swallowing my pride, I slowly bent down onto my knees. My hands trembled as I pressed the cloth against the stained floor and began wiping away the spilled wine while hundreds of guests watched in complete silence. I kept my eyes on the floor as I wiped away the wine and broken glass. The ballroom was so quiet that I could hear the cloth sliding across the polished surface. Every movement felt heavier than the last. I wanted the moment to end as quickly as possible, But hundreds of people were watching, making every second feel endless. At the head table, Gage Thorne had been speaking with several executives while casually eating his dinner. Like everyone else, he had noticed the commotion, but at first he assumed the venue staff would take care of it. He paid little attention until he happened to glance toward the woman kneeling on the dance floor. As I lifted my head for a brief moment, the bright lights above the ballroom fell across my face. Gage froze. His eyes widened as recognition hit him almost instantly. He had seen me before, not at public events or business parties, but inside private boardrooms where billion-dollar investment decisions were made. Every major funding request for his company had required my final approval. The last 3 acquisitions that helped expand his technology empire had only happened because I personally signed off on them. The woman everyone believed was a house cleaner was the same person who had approved investments worth billions of dollars. For a few seconds, Gage couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked at me again, making sure he wasn't mistaken. There was no doubt in his mind. The quiet woman being forced to scrub a dance floor was the founder and managing director of Vanguard Crest. His grip loosened without him realizing it. The fork slipped from his hand and struck his dinner plate with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. The unexpected noise caused nearly every guest to turn toward the head table. Gage's face had gone completely pale. He stared at me with open disbelief, unable to understand how one of the most respected business leaders in the country was being publicly humiliated by her own family. The Sterling family immediately noticed his expression. Their confident smiles slowly disappeared. Richard and Eleanor stopped laughing as they followed his line of sight toward me. Even Vance looked confused. They expected Gage to be amused like everyone else, yet he looked deeply disturbed instead. No one spoke. The laughter that had filled the ballroom only moments earlier vanished completely. Guests exchanged nervous glances, sensing that something far bigger than a spilled drink had just unfolded. Although they didn't yet understand the reason, they could all see it in Gage Thorne's face. Something was terribly, unbelievably wrong. The silence lasted only a few seconds before it was broken by the sharp sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Every guest turned toward the head table as Gage Thorne rose so quickly that his chair slid backward behind him. His face was filled with disbelief. Without saying a word to anyone around him, he walked directly across the ballroom. Richard smiled, assuming the billionaire was coming over to compliment the wedding or laugh along with the joke. Eleanor straightened her dress, expecting a friendly conversation. Neither of them realized that Gage never even looked in their direction. He walked straight past them. When he reached me, he did something that stunned every person in the room. He lowered himself onto one knee beside me. Before I could react, he gently took the damp cleaning cloth from my trembling hands. He looked at it for a moment with obvious disbelief, then tossed it onto a nearby serving cart. I looked up at him, surprised to see genuine concern on his face. In a clear voice that carried through the silent ballroom, Gage asked, "Miss Tinsley, what on earth are you doing? Why is the managing director of Vanguard Crest cleaning a floor?" The words echoed through the room. For several seconds nobody moved. Confused whispers spread among the guests as they looked from Gage to me and back again. Many had never heard the name Vanguard Crest before, while others immediately recognized it as one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. Richard suddenly laughed, though it sounded forced. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said quickly. "She's our daughter. She's nobody important. She just cleans houses." Eleanor nodded so fast it almost looked desperate. "You've mistaken her for someone else," she added with an uneasy smile. "She's always lived a simple life." Gage slowly stood and faced them. "I don't make mistakes like this," he said firmly. "I have personally sat across the table from Ms. Tinsley during private investment meetings. Every major expansion my company completed over the past few years happened because she approved the funding." The color drained from my parents' faces. Gage looked around the ballroom before continuing. "She isn't an employee at Vanguard Crest. She owns it. She built the firm herself. My company depends on financing approved by her organization, just like many other businesses represented in this room." A wave of shock spread through the guests. Executives stared at me in disbelief. The confident smiles that had filled the head table disappeared. In only a few moments, the woman they had mocked as a maid had become the most important person in the ballroom. The ballroom remained silent as Gage's words settled over the room. People who had been laughing only moments earlier now looked at one another in confusion. Some guests quietly searched their memories, trying to place the name Vanguard crest. Others already knew exactly what it meant, and the expressions on their faces changed immediately. Among them was Charles Sterling Vance's father and the head of the Sterling family. Unlike the others, he didn't need an explanation. The moment he heard the company's name, the color drained from his face. A memory rushed back to him. Several months earlier, his legal advisors had informed him that the family's largest business loans had been quietly purchased by a private investment firm. They had warned him that the new owner held every legal right to renegotiate the terms or demand repayment according to the existing agreements. At the time, Charles had dismissed the matter, believing the investor would remain anonymous and continue business as usual. Now he finally understood who that investor was. His eyes slowly turned toward me. For the first time that evening, he wasn't looking at the woman my parents had called a maid. He was looking at the person who ultimately controlled financial agreements worth millions of dollars connected to his family's companies. Richard noticed the sudden fear on Charles's face but couldn't understand why. He looked from one person to another, waiting for someone to laugh and prove the whole situation was a misunderstanding. Nobody did. I slowly stood from the floor. After brushing the dust from my dress, I straightened my shoulders and took a deep breath. The embarrassment that had filled me only moments earlier disappeared. I wasn't standing there as the forgotten daughter anymore. I was standing as the woman who had spent years building a company through hard work, discipline, and quiet determination. I calmly faced my parents. "I never lied to either of you," I said. "Every time you asked what I did for a living, I told you I worked in asset management." Neither of them answered. "You simply chose to hear whatever made you feel superior," I continued. "You created your own version of my life because it made it easier to believe I had failed." Richard opened his mouth but no words came out. My mother stared at me with shaking hands, her confidence completely gone. Around the ballroom, conversations had stopped entirely. The guests no longer saw me as someone who deserved pity or ridicule. They were watching a business leader calmly reclaim her dignity while two people who had spent years tearing her down struggled to accept the truth they had refused to see. The mood inside the ballroom changed almost instantly. Just minutes earlier, people had laughed at my expense and treated me like someone who didn't matter. Now those same guests stood in complete silence, watching my parents with curiosity instead of admiration. The confidence Richard and Eleanor had carried throughout the evening disappeared, replaced by panic they could no longer hide. My father forced a weak smile and slowly walked toward me. His hands shook as he tried to speak. "Tinsley, sweetheart," he said quietly. "This has all been one big misunderstanding. We were only joking. You know we never meant any real harm." His voice was nothing like the confident tone he had used earlier. He searched my face for any sign that I would forgive him, but I simply looked back without saying a word. A moment later, my mother hurried over. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out, trying to wrap her arms around me. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "Please don't be upset. We're family." I stepped backward before she could touch me. The movement was small, but everyone noticed it. For years they had pushed me away whenever I needed kindness. Now that they believed I held power they wanted, they suddenly remembered we were related. Their affection arrived only after the truth came out, and that made it impossible to believe. "You don't get to pretend none of this happened," I said calmly. "You made your choices long before tonight." Neither of them knew how to respond. Across the room, Daphne finally broke down. Her makeup was streaked with tears as she looked around at the guests who were no longer paying attention to her wedding. The conversations were about me, Gage, and Vanguard Crest instead of the bride and groom. "This was supposed to be my day," she shouted through her tears. "You couldn't let me have one perfect moment. You planned this to steal all the attention from me." I stared at her in disbelief. "I didn't expose anything," I replied. "I came here quietly and planned to leave quietly. Everything that happened tonight started because of the way all of you treated me." Vance tried to comfort Daphne, but she pulled away from him, crying even harder. She wasn't apologizing for what had happened or showing regret for how I had been treated. She was angry because the celebration no longer revolved around her. The guests watched the family argue in uncomfortable silence. The perfect image my parents had spent years creating had fallen apart in a single evening, and there was no way to put it back together. The ballroom was still completely silent when I turned toward Gage. Every guest watched carefully, waiting to see what would happen next. The fear on the faces of the Sterling family and my parents told me they finally understood that this was no misunderstanding. Years of lies, insults, and humiliation had brought them to this exact moment. I looked at Gage and spoke in the same calm voice I used during board meetings. "Gage, please contact my legal department as soon as this reception is over," I said. "I want a complete audit of every real estate project connected to the Sterling family. Make sure our compliance team reviews every financial agreement and confirms that all loan conditions have been followed exactly as written." Gage nodded without hesitation. "I'll make the call immediately," he replied. I continued, "Also instruct our finance division to review my father's logistics company. If every requirement has not been satisfied, proceed according to the loan agreements. No special treatment. Handle it exactly as we would for any other borrower." The words landed like thunder inside the ballroom. Charles Sterling lowered his head as though he already knew what was coming. His lawyers had warned him months earlier that the new lender had every legal right to enforce the contracts. Now that lender was standing only a few feet away. Richard rushed toward me, no longer pretending to smile. "You can't do this," he shouted. "That's my company. Hundreds of people work for me. If those loans are called in, we'll be finished." His voice cracked with panic. "You'll destroy everything I've spent my life building. We won't survive more than a month." I remained calm. "For years you taught me that every decision has consequences," I answered. "Tonight you're finally experiencing your own lesson." He reached for my arm, but I stepped away before he could touch me. "Please," he begged. "I'm your father." I looked directly into his eyes. "Were you thinking like a father when you forced your daughter onto the floor in front of hundreds of people?" He couldn't answer. The room remained completely still. After a long pause, I spoke one final time. "You spent years telling everyone I was only good enough to clean houses." Richard's shoulders dropped as he realized what I was about to say. "Then I guess you'll have plenty of time to learn how to clean houses." No one laughed. The words echoed through the ballroom, leaving Richard speechless. For the first time in my life, the power he had used to control me was gone, replaced by the consequences of his own choices. After saying what I needed to say, I looked around the ballroom one last time. The room that had been filled with laughter, music, and celebration only an hour earlier had become a place of confusion and panic. Guests whispered among themselves while business leaders quietly slipped away to make phone calls. My parents stood frozen, unable to accept that everything they believed was under their control had disappeared in a single evening. I picked up my purse, thanked Gage for treating me with respect, and walked toward the exit without looking back. No one tried to stop me. The sound of my heels echoed through the ballroom until the doors closed behind me. As I stepped outside, I took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. I had not planned to expose anyone or ruin a wedding. I had only defended my dignity after it was taken from me. The following months brought exactly what the legal agreements required. Vanguard Crest completed its reviews without bending a single rule. Independent auditors examined every financial record connected to the Sterling family's business interests. Several projects failed to meet their obligations, and the required repayments moved forward according to the signed contracts. My father's logistics company was also reviewed. Years of poor financial decisions and missed obligations left the business unable to recover. Within months, the company entered bankruptcy proceedings. It wasn't because of revenge alone. The problems had existed for years. The truth simply caught up with them. The Sterling family faced their own crisis. To settle outstanding debts, they were forced to sell several valuable real estate holdings. Their carefully built public image collapsed as investors and political supporters quietly walked away. The influence they had proudly displayed at the wedding faded faster than anyone expected. My parents tried many times to contact me. They sent letters, left voice messages, and even asked relatives to convince me to forgive them. I never responded. Forgiveness did not require allowing people back into my life, especially those who had repeatedly chosen cruelty over love. Months later, I sat in my office overlooking the city skyline. The morning sun reflected off the glass buildings as my team prepared for another day of meetings and investments. Everything around me had been earned through years of discipline, sacrifice, and hard work. I never needed my family's approval to succeed. Looking out the window, I realized the greatest victory wasn't watching anyone lose their fortune. It was knowing I had built my own future with honesty while they destroyed theirs through arrogance, pride, and the way they chose to treat the people who loved them most.